we're already.
Sorry. Yes.
So, Deepening Zen, The Long Maturation, book 1 is already out. You've mentioned it, Kathy, and I hope it's inspiring lots of people. We're already finished with the editing of Deepening Zen, book 2, chapter 12 out of 17. So we seem to be on target to have a new book coming out in September. Hopefully it'll work out. One never knows, of course. The Deepening Zen book, I decided to share my experience in Zen practice with as many people as possible by doing the book. I find that I teach in a little bit different way than many people do. This comes out of my experience with both training in the United States at an early area when the Rochester Zen Center was only one of 3 Zen practice centers available to people in the United States. There were no others. Later on, Edo Shimano came, and Robert Aitken, Diamond Sangha came, and Robert Aitken was already running a little Zen group when I was in Rochester, but he hadn't been authorized to teach yet. And Edo Shimano came from his group. And then there was Joshu Sasaki Roshi. And then the whole thing expanded into many, many more places. Soto, there was San Francisco Zen Center. ZCLA started pretty soon then too. And there was a group with Katagiri Roshi up in the sort of central north of America. And that was it. But those teachers all taught in the very traditional Zen, Japanese Zen way. They had no other way to do it. First of all, a number of them were Japanese themselves. And then also Roshi Kapleau and Robert Aitken they trained in Japan, and so they experienced Zen as it was taught in Japan. The Japanese culture is different from American culture or Western culture in general. And because of that, it was possible to teach effective Zen practice within that culture, the Japanese culture, without getting into anything psychological. But as people are discovering more and more in the United States these days, there's a broad overlap between psychology or psychological work and Zen practice. And it was interesting that in the earlier years in Rochester, Roshi was true to his generation of disdaining psychology or therapy. That was the same way with my father. They were only 1 year apart, actually. And, when I was growing up, you just didn't tell your secrets to anybody, which led to a lot of challenge for a lot of people. And then 1 or 2 of Roshi's students started going to therapy. And he discovered how much easier it was and how much more effective it was for them to do their Zen practice. And so he changed his whole feelings about it, which is fortunate because as we discussed in one of the chapters of book 2, there is this broad overlap. And Zen, well, let's start with psychology. Psychotherapy can do a lot to help us learn to navigate or get skilled in navigating our basic interpersonal lives, our experiences in growing up and that kind of thing. And particularly if we've been traumatized, it's very, very important to do concurrently with Zen practice. But Zen practice can take us beyond that. Psychology therapy can bring us to a point where we're relatively at ease in our lives. We've managed to learn how to navigate difficult situations. We've learned how to see through to a certain degree our issues that are based on our growing up. But in terms of full liberation, it has its limits. It's very effective in what it does, and it's important to recognize that. But Zen can take us far deeper to the point where we are no longer attached to any ideas of ourselves, and therefore it's as if we've broken through a cage that has kept us limited in our experiences and our reactions, and totally free. It's a little like the little baby bird gets kicked out of the nest because it doesn't, it's scared of getting out there, and it's way down to the ground, and it gets kicked out of the nest and suddenly realizes it can fly. And Zen practice can open us to a point where we are not caught by any kind of situation. It doesn't matter, good, bad, or whatever. In my own life, I'll back up a little bit now and say that I was a diplomatic wife. We lived in Burma, Thailand, and Turkey. And in Turkey, everything fell apart. And I lost everything that mattered to me. My kids, even because the State Department rules were that the school they were going to could only be paid for by the State Department if they were living with their father. And their father transferred to actually Saigon. And this is in the mid-70s. He was there at the end of the war and had written me a letter actually that said he wasn't sure he was going to come out alive. It was terrifying because my kids were there, and I missed my kids terribly, and I had, I still care about my ex-husband. And so thankfully they all survived, but it added to the anguish. I realized that there was nothing outside me that was ever going to give me lasting happiness. A new job, a new relationship, new haircut, new anything, brand new car, great job, whatever, would only last for a while. And then it would be painful again or challenging again. And so it was very clear, particularly in that situation, which was devastating, that I only had two options: either commit suicide, which I didn't want to do, I was actually afraid to do, and the other was just bite the bullet and start finding whatever I could find within myself that would be freeing. Now, we all pretty much, any of us that come to practice have at some point in our lives felt that something was missing, that there was something, as one person described it, just beyond the veil, that was really, really important to get back to, very valuable. And we'd lost contact with it at some point long in the past and needed to get in touch with it again. And that was part of my life as well. I felt that even as a child. And so that helped when I ended up finally deciding to do Zen practice. And so the basic thing that I have found valuable in our Zen practice, we have the practices, the extended out breath in our case, and we can become a mechanical thing, which isn't going to get us anywhere, except perhaps more relaxed. But if we extend the out breath with this what I call openness to possibility, because it cannot be described any other way, then a not knowing, as Shunryu Suzuki said, beginner's mind. Or as Suksan Sunim, a Korean Zen master who's now deceased as well, said, only don't know. So if we begin our Zen practice and do our breath practice, assuming we are looking for a particular specific goal, we're holding ourselves above that possibility. But if we go experiencing that out breath, and also just anytime we're walking around, doing anything, being as present as possible, with that kind of curiosity going on in our mind, that is what can lead us to eventually, if we persist, awakening. So I started doing Zazen in 1974, January 1st, as you already know. And initially it was extremely difficult. Every time I sat on the cushion, I burst into tears because I missed my kids so much. And eventually I realized that I had no other choice. I had to do it. And I went to, no, this happened first, I guess. I was still living in Turkey, and I would commute to the States once a year for about a month to do some work that I had finished up a job that I actually had my own business before I went to Turkey, and I still had clients that I could continue to work for if I wanted to. And so I would go back, work for a month, and go back to Turkey, where I also worked. And nothing to do in the evening other than I did Zazen, of course. I also used to do Zazen at lunchtime in the office where I was working in, and everybody was gone, so I just had the space to do it. And I was in a bookstore one evening. Back then, there were maybe 5 books on Zen. And so I was looking at these books, and I picked up one, and there was some kind of, all I can explain it as, kind of a mind jiggle in my brain. And so I thought, that's interesting. So I bought the book, went back to where I was staying, and opened it at random. It happened to open to a story that was attributed to Hakuin, but it didn't happen to Hakuin. It actually happened, I learned much, much later when I was in Japan, to his grandfather in Zen, Shido Bunan, whose name, by the way, means the great way is not difficult. And as I read the story, which is about a middle-aged monk in 16th century Japan, who is living in a seaside village in his little temple, and suddenly he's accused of fathering a child with an unwed teenage mom. And so this is really unbelievably upsetting. In our culture, whether it's Canadian, American, whatever, in the West, it's these days, it's not a super big deal to be unmarried and have a child. But in 16th century Japan, it was a terrible situation, incredibly, unbelievably embarrassing to the family, to the whole village. And so when the baby was born, the grandparents brought it to Shido Bunan and said, here, you did this. You're responsible. This is your kid. You take care of it. And Shido Bunan was so deeply realized, so let go, that he only needed to say, in fact, he didn't really need to say anything, but he said something that's very difficult to translate into English. In Japanese, it's soka. It means an extremely humble way of saying, oh, seems like this, doesn't it? No objection. No, how could you believe this? I mean, the mom said that he was the father, so there's no arguing with that one. And he took the baby, raised it for a year, which was very, very difficult for him because the whole village scorned him, and nobody would feed him, give him food. And yet he had this infant to raise as well. It is said that he carried around on his back like an old grandmother. And after a year, the girl confessed who the father really was. And so now the grandparents are extremely embarrassed again, even more so. And they come with their heads down and ask for the baby back. And again, he has no reason, no felt reason to say, well, I should have told you so, or how could you have believed this anyway? No thoughts even in that direction. Again, so calm. Oh, seems like this, doesn't it? And when I read that, my mind plummeted into the mind state of Shirobunan, and it was amazing. I guess I was in it. I don't know how long I was in it, because when I sort of came to, there were streams of joy, tears of joy streaming down my face. It was incredible, the freedom not to be caught by stuff. And it's real. And that kept me going for a long time, because initially, for years, Zen practice was difficult. Eventually, I realized that it was so hard to do it on my own that I had to go somewhere where I would have to do it. And that meant the Rochester Zen Center, because the person that showed me how to do Zazen in Turkey happened to belong to the Rochester Zen Center. So that was the only place I sort of knew. But it felt right. And particularly after that experience in Washington, D.C., with opening into that incredibly free mind state, I thought, what on earth has happened? And I called up Rochester and said, can I talk to Roshi Kapleau? There's something happened, I don't understand it. And they said, well, you have to go to a workshop, and then after you go to the workshop, you can talk to him. So the next week was the workshop. So I went up to Rochester, and the next morning, they let people who are staying there after the workshop to go to the morning sitting, which is a Sunday morning sitting, and there is chanting. And as soon as that big kesu, do you know what a kesu is? It's this huge bowl, bronze bowl that you strike, and it's kind of a gong, and it has a wonderful tone, and it's part of the chanting service. And so I went to that, and as soon as I heard that kesu strike, again, I burst into tears. It was like I was coming home. I went and talked to Roshi Kapleau afterwards, but I was still too caught in my conditioning. And so I was very nervous talking to him. And he asked me multiple times exactly when that event had happened. And I told him, and then he said, well, you know, that book, which was Zen Flesh, Zen Bones, it's not a very good translation. If you want to read about Hawkwing, you should read this other book, which was an academic book by Professor Yampolsky. It was the only other book available in English about Hawkwing. So I dutifully bought it, read it. It was terribly boring, and continued my struggle with Zazen, because there was nothing else I could do. Also, that experience had really made me recognize the possibility. And I continued on, eventually went to live at the Rochester Zen Center, even though I didn't know whether I'd be able to have space there, whether I'd be accepted there. And in fact, I moved from Turkey and cleaned houses for a living until 8 months later, I was allowed to be at the Rochester Zen Center. Before that, I went to every sitting, but once I was living at the Rochester Zen Center, it was somewhat easier because I was with the Sangha. I was with other people who were practicing, and that is incredible support. We have the refuges. I take refuge in Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha. The Sangha support is really, really incredible. We share our energies. Roshi Kapleau used to liken it to the flight of Canada geese who go in this V formation, and they keep changing places. So the leader is not always the leader, but something about the physiology or the physics of the wave, whatever is generated from the flapping wings keeps the younger, weaker birds buoyed up and able to fly far longer than the adults are able to fly. And it's sort of like that with Sangha. The more senior people who have a deeper level of practice and more experience are able to sort of support energetically newcomers and people, not as advanced as they are. So Sangha is incredibly helpful. I'm so glad you all have a Sangha. So eventually, I kept on going. And after 20 years of working directly under Roshi Kapleau, very concentrated, I would take time off and then go back to the Rochester Zen Center. So I would be like 3 months on, 3 months off. And somehow I managed to keep another business going. I started another business. I have a background in design, and including graphic design. So when I lived in Santa Fe, it was graphic design that helped support me. And I go back and forth. And that actually helped me because I experienced a certain amount of trauma when I was growing up. And it helps when you have that kind of a history to do your intensive Zen practice in batches. The other thing about that is, and this is what I recognized at Sogenji. Hold on a second. The Sogenji schedule is so intense. We're sitting 12, 14 hours a day, most days of the month, with what we call Sanzen, which is Dokusan, twice a day on all those days. And then there's maybe 3 days in the month, which are called free days, where you're still expected to come to breakfast. And between breakfast and dinner, which all depends on the season, because it goes by the light in the sky, you're free. Wash your clothes, brush your... The schedule was so intense at Sogenji that you would have 5 minutes of space, maybe 2 or 3 times a day, where you had to choose between brushing your teeth or taking a quick nap. And the experience was tremendous, especially after I'd already done 20 years of practice, intense practice. And the only thing was that there was so little time off that you didn't have a chance to process what you had uncovered in your Zen practice. And for me, I'd already learned how to do that. But for people newer to the practice, I saw a number of really, really fine practitioners dedicated to the practice who got to a point where there was not a chance to process things that had come up for them, that they bailed, they left, they had to leave because it got to be too hard, too much. So our schedule at Sogen at Mountain Gate has that flexibility in it because it's important. So basically, that's kind of my history. And this is why, having trained in both of those places, which were very different training, Rochester and Sogenji, each had their amazing advantages, and each had their drawbacks, that I tried to do some kind of combination practice here that allowed people to really dive deep and then also allow them time to process anything that would come up. And working with students, because things will come up in your Zazen. And if they're just kind of mild background stuff, that's one thing, just ignore it. But if it's something big deal, then it's important to turn and take a look and work with it. In the 1980s, I think, in the United States, no, actually it was in the 70s, I think, that there was a doctor in a hospital in California who had initiated a program of weight loss for obese people. And it was highly successful up to a point when suddenly everybody reversed course, or most people reversed course, and stopped losing weight. In fact, started gaining it back. And some of them even dropped out of the program. And he was very puzzled by this. So he began to do more investigation. And it turns out that the people who dropped out of the program and the people that started gaining weight again had what were later called adverse childhood experiences. This is relatively new psychology and very, very important. People growing up, and it didn't used to be recognized back in the 1900s, people growing up, some of us have happy childhoods. Some of us have truly loving, caring, supportive parents. Others of us have parents who are not necessarily so. They might get distracted by things in their own lives and kind of ignore their kids. I was at in a waiting room for something or other some years back. And along in the waiting room with me was a couple and a child, a little boy, maybe 5 years old. Both parents were absolutely engrossed in their cell phones. The little boy kept trying to interact with them, and they kept rebuffing him or ignoring him. Finally, he went and got a little cup of water from the water cooler for himself. Didn't spill it or anything. He just drank it. And they both complained to him about how he shouldn't have done that and that kind of thing, negative reaction. That little boy has experienced, because I'm sure that wasn't the only incident where parents were both engrossed in other things and ignoring him. That is one of the adverse childhood experiences, is being ignored, being abandoned, being rejected. And there are a number of others, and they color our growing up. They're painful. Children need nurturing. And when they don't get it, it is devastating. Nowadays, there are 8 different adverse childhood experiences listed. You can look it up on the web, but they're very significant. And this is one of the advances in culture that we're experiencing. But when a person has experienced the adverse childhood experiences, we learn to compensate for them. And there are various different ways that people compensate for painful experiences. But that comes out in our life, it drives our lives, and it also drives our Zen practice. So this is why it's so helpful to work with a psychologist, a therapist who is positive about Zen practice, because unfortunately here and there are therapists, at least there used to be, who were not at all positive about meditation. In fact, one of my students who went to therapy a good deal of her life, she had a terrible, terrible childhood. Her second therapist just poo-pooed the whole Zen thing and said she was just barking up the wrong tree, basically. And so thankfully she left him and went to somebody else who was understanding. But it can make a big positive impact in our Zen practice. So don't be afraid to do that. Even though, 20, 30 years ago, culturally, it was not particularly accepted, but it's important, and it can take your Zen practice far deeper. The therapists I know, basically the ones there were a lot of Zen therapists when I was in Rochester, people who did therapy, and I mean, as a profession, and also were Zen students. And they've all said to me that when a student of Zen does practice and therapy, that they progress so much faster in their Zen practice and in their therapy. And I want to mention one other thing, and that is that back in the early 1980s, there was, oddly enough, he was a philosopher, but somehow ended up getting involved with a lot with psychology at University of Chicago, I think it was. His name was Eugene Gendlin. And at one point, they decided to do some research into why there were some people who could do therapy, and within the first 3 or 4 sessions, they had really gone far into their release from their what brought them to practice. But there are others who, even 3 times a week for 10 years, had come out with a very clear mental understanding of why they were caught or where they were caught, but no progress in freeing themselves from it. And they discovered that what made the difference was that people who were able to really transform rather rapidly did something that he called tuning into the felt sense. That is the feeling of energy in our bodies. And, if you think about being angry, you sort of jump into your head, and the story goes round and round and round and round, and it keeps fueling the anger. And there was a time in my life when I was a teenager when I thought, I'm still angry 2 weeks from whatever the incident happened. When am I ever going to let this go? And the thing is that if we're willing to tune into our physical body, the experience of what's going on in our body, instead of escaping into avoidance through thinking about it, tremendous relief can happen. We can process it very fast, but there's a learning curve on it. It doesn't happen initially very fast because we're so practiced in avoiding unpleasant feelings and unpleasant experiences. But this is why it's an important aspect of our Zen practice here at Mountain Gate to go into our sensations in our body. As we're doing the breathing practice, we feel completely the energy of our body breathing out. We feel the presence of our body breathing out. We don't think about whether it's coming out of our nose or where. We just do it and feel it in our body. And that goes a long way towards going deeper in our Zen practice. So hopefully you all will be interested in reading book 2. If you haven't already read book 1, I hope you do, because there's not a lot of Zen teachers in the West that actually approach Zen practice in this way. Gradually, more and more are, which is quite wonderful because I found it so effective. So anyway, thank you for listening to me. And if anybody's got any questions, please don't hesitate to ask.
Thank you so much, Roshi. Really appreciate your words. You're always an inspiration.
Thank you.
And the book that you talked about, that was by Eugene
It's
Gedlin.
called Focusing.
Focusing, yes. I've read
by Eugene. I guess he was an import, And his name when he was living in Europe was Gendlin, but he changed it to Gendlin. It's still spelled the same way, Gendlin. Yeah, and for anybody who's not practiced in how to do that focusing on the felt sense, it gives very specific instructions on doing it. I feel that every Zen student should read that book. And we use it also when we're doing the regaining balance retreats for women veterans with PTSD, which are not sessions, by the way. They're very, very different. We give a copy of that book. It's only $7.95 these days, at least in American dollars. And we give a copy to each one that comes to those retreats because it's so helpful, both in therapy and in Zen practice.
Thank you. And I'm finding your book invaluable.
Oh, well, thank you.
I really am. As someone who has PTSD and difficult stuff, a history, yeah, your help has been incredible.
Oh, great. I'm so glad. I come from the same background in a sense, growing up with trauma. And so I want to do what I can to help other people realize how to become free of that.
And
my life has changed as a result. I used to be so caught in it and so angry, and not anymore. And it's such a relief.
Yes, your guidance is invaluable. I appreciate it.
You're welcome.
So does anyone else have any questions? Deborah lives in New Brunswick.
Uh-huh.
Wow, you're spread out all over the place.
Yes, we are. Thank you. Can you hear me all right? I've been having problems. Okay, good. Thank you so much for mentioning the story about Hawkwin, or should I say Shidobanan. That has been a story that we have shared with our daughter for the last 30 years when we get into Zen discussions. So it has a very important place in my heart. So thank you for that.
Oh, you're welcome.
And also for your comments about Sangha, because being in New Brunswick, this Sangha has been very important to me as well, and helped me tremendously. One of the things that this Sangha does not know about me is that, like you, I scored about a 9.5 out of 10 on the ACE test, the Adverse Childhood Experiences, and like Kathy, ended up with PTSD. And so a couple of years ago, I've been practicing Zen on and off for about 30 years. A couple of years ago, I went to a clinic to treat the PTSD and resulting depression that used ketamine. And I'm wondering, through that treatment, I had 4 sessions, and I was tremendously blessed, probably because of my practice, in having 4 entheogenic experiences that were amazing. I went places that I'd never been able to go with my sitting with Zazen. And I'm just wondering, because of your emphasis on psychology and Zen, do you have any thoughts about psychedelics and Zen in terms of end of life, trauma, that sort of thing? Can you comment on that?
Yeah. Very, very recently, there have been legal studies. It took quite a bit of work for them to become legalized in the use of psychedelics, specifically MDMA and psilocybin, and with people with PTSD. And under the guided protocol, which involves specific doses of those drugs in the with the presence of a therapist, and then follow up work with a therapist, it's been quite effective. I think that if people do that work and also do Zazen, it could be very effective. I mean, it's been shown to be highly effective, not with everybody, but with most people. I would not advise people to sort of do it on their own. If you do it within the program where there's a trained therapist, then it can be highly effective. But to take those drugs on your own, you may get the dosing wrong, and also you don't have the support system of the therapist. So it's not really the job of a Zen teacher to be a therapist, although in a sense we do become therapists. But to have someone who's trained in that specific protocol can be very effective. I know the VA has, the Veterans Administration in America has sanctioned, I can't remember, I think it might be psilocybin treatment. They do it again with that protocol, but there are other therapists who have taken it on as well, and may or may not have the training that is essential to really effectively work with people under those drugs. So it's something that could work as a separate way of working with a trained therapist that could, I think, probably enhance your Zen practice, because it gets certain things out of the way. Apparently, my understanding is that it changes the story, and that's another interesting subject, because memory is predictive, and when we have an experience, it's brand new, and then we put that in the file cabinet, so to speak, and project that particular experience on any other similar experience, even though it might not be identical, but we are removing ourselves from actually experienced what we're experiencing by sort of pasting this picture over it. I don't know if that helps.
Oh, it most definitely does. Thank you, because I had struggled with the Buddhist sort of no about intoxicants.
Yeah.
And the history of the unfortunate history of psychedelics in the 60s. But I made peace with that. So thank you for your comments. I tremendously appreciate that.
Oh, you're very welcome. By the way, everyone, I was a landed immigrant in Canada when I was a child. I went to my grade school in Sault Ste. Marie. And I hear your accents, and I love it.
Oh, thank you, Roshi. And thank you, Deborah, for sharing.
Yes.
Yeah.
What you said is quite important.
Yes. Anyone else have any questions? Oh, Onsen.
I was going to not open my mouth, but there you go. I really appreciate it. First of all, thank you for that fabulous, wonderful talk, Roshi. And I really appreciate you addressing psychological therapy and Zen as separate things that can work in conjunction, because I think with the acceptance of, people talking about trauma and psychology, so often I see them sort of conflated, and there's not enough clarification between the two in some sanghas. So people who really need psychological help are still thinking they can somehow sort it out through Zen practice, and that doesn't work. So I appreciate that very much. That's something that's, and I'm wondering, I did talk therapy. Yeah, I'm another one who's had a troublesome childhood. So many of us. And I I found talk therapy did nothing, and I stumbled into what is called somatic therapy, and I'm wondering if that's the same thing.
It's not at all the same thing. Well, experiencing, somatic therapy, Peter Levine, that is a dynamite therapeutic module. I mean, he really nailed it.
Oh yeah. Yeah,
Yeah.
I spent years talking, telling stories, just exactly what you're saying, telling stories. And then all of a sudden I was in this therapy where it was finding where these stories were in my body and unhinging them. And I
Yep.
felt as though I was rewriting my neurological system. And from that, even though I had done meditation over the years, different kinds of things, different embodied practices. I knew about Zen. I'd read about Zen, but through that, all of a sudden, it's like boom, and I started sitting zazen, and I didn't know I was sitting zazen, and that led me directly into Zen. So,
That's terrific.
so
That
this
is,
embodied, and that's when I realized this is an embodied practice.
mhm.
Yeah.
It really is. There's no other way around it. And as you probably already know, trauma is stored in our body as energy, because what makes trauma is dangerous, terrifying experiences that we're stuck in. There's an interesting thing that you can have a terrifying experience, but if you're able to get out of it, and here's an example. Apparently some years back, maybe 10, 15 years ago at this point, a school bus full of kids was hijacked by a guy who drove it back to his land and covered it with dirt. And then I guess was claiming some sort of payment for it or whatever. There was a 12-year-old kid in the school bus. The rest of the kids were younger. And these days, school buses are built with an escape hatch in the roof. And he was able to have a presence of mind to open that, to see his way clear, and to help all the kids out of the school bus and then himself. And he did not get PTSD because he was able to successfully manipulate the situation in such a way that he wasn't caught in it. So anyway, back to the talk therapy versus somatic experiencing. Even though talk therapy has been studied more than any other therapy, the effectiveness is only as good as the drugs for depression. In other words, it's only effective for a certain percentage of people, and it's a fairly low percentage. I think it's 30 something. So, but the somatic experiencing, and there are quite a number of people that do it now, is highly effective. When I started reading that book, it transformed my life. Particularly because I was so shut down, I couldn't feel anything except a kind of numbness. And my therapist at the time suggested that I start journaling my feelings, the sensations. And the first time I wrote a sentence, it was, all I can feel is this vague nothingness, not in the Zen sense. and then something shifted just by doing that, because you have to tune in order to write this down. You can't do it on a computer. You have to handwrite it, because that allows you to stay present with the experience, as well as actually being able to describe it and write it down, and then it releases. And I only had to write about 3 sentences, and then the whole thing was transformed in that moment. Now, I'm not my whole life, but that difficult feeling was transformed. And interestingly enough, the Tibetan Buddhists, long ago, there was a, what was he, 10th, 14th century, something like that, teacher named Longchenpa, and he identified how to tune in to the felt sense. He didn't call it that, but he said, you know, in the first moment, no matter what's come up, in the first moment, basically, I'm paraphrasing this, tune in its first inception, as soon as you can catch that feeling, before karma has been produced. In other words, before you've reacted, and then stay present, fully present with that energy, and you will find yourself freed of that energy in its own place without it having to be gotten rid of. And that's exactly how it feels. It's like suddenly you've got space around this sensation of rage, and it's not driving you because you're tuned into the experience of it in your body. And you're able to then clearly see a positive way out of it, because it says it's freed in its own place without having to be gotten rid of. And that's focusing. That's what can happen in our Zen practice. It's an incredible tool.
Thank you, Roshi.
You're welcome. I think we're getting close to timeout.
I think we are. Yes, yes.
So thank you for having me. I've enjoyed speaking with you all, and you've got good questions.
Really appreciate it.
I wish you all well with your deepening Zen practice.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
I think now we'll just end with the universal transfer of merit and the closing invocation. And again, deepest gratitude, Roshi.
Oh, and gratitude to you all too. It's you're our expanded Sangha.
Thank you. May this merit extend universally to all, so that we, together with all beings, realize the Buddha way. Hey, hey. My mind is blank. All Buddhas throughout space and time, all honored ones, bodhisattvas, mahasattvas, wisdom beyond wisdom, Mahaprajna Paramita. Oh, thank you, Roshi. This has been wonderful.
Thank you, Kathy, and thank all of you. And may your practice deepen immeasurably.
We appreciate it. Okay. You have a wonderful day.
Thank you.
Hey, everybody.
All of you too.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. And it's so
Bye-bye.
good to see you.
Yeah, I know.
Don't forget to end the recording.
Okay.
Thank you.